Okay, I'm just going to provide a brief run-through refresher of the anatomy and physiology of the auditory system before we get started. And I just want to remind everybody, if you have questions or you're still feeling unclear or uncertain about any of this, you need to let me know. A lot of the testing information that we're going to talk about is going to build on the anatomy and physiology concepts, and it's going to require that you have a good, clear working understanding of the various different pieces of the auditory system. So first we have, this is sort of an x-ray view where you have the bony cochlea and the semicircular canals are actually housed deep inside the skull in the petrous portion of the temporal bone here. And here you've got sort of a side view. The peripheral auditory system is made up of the external ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear, and we're going to talk about all of these briefly. So the outer ear, when we're talking about the outer ear, it has essentially two major components: the pinna, which is the visible skin and cartilage structure that you actually see, and then the external auditory meatus or ear canal. The pinna has several visible landmarks, and hopefully you will learn more about them in one of your anatomy and physiology classes. At this point, you should be sort of familiar with what the concha is, what the tragus is, where the earlobe is, etc. And then when we talk about the ear canal, one thing I just wanted to show you was the ear canal. This is a view of the ear canal if you were looking down from the top of somebody's head at their ear canal, where the front of the person's nose is up here and the back of the person's head is down here. Many people have ear canals that have two bends in them, and that serves as a protective mechanism so that if people stuff things in their ear, they can't get straight to the eardrum. However, in terms of otoscopy, it's important to remember, because if you stick an otoscope in at the wrong angle, all you're going to see is the wall of the ear canal. Likewise, if you stick it up here, you're going to see a little bit farther, but you're still going to run into the wall of the ear canal. A lot of the time, what you need to remember to do during otoscopy is to use one hand to actually move the pinna, which changes the shape of the ear canal, so that you can get to a point where you can see all the way past the curves down to the eardrum. And we'll practice that in class. The middle ear is made up of the tympanic membrane, the ossicles, the eustachian tube, the two muscles, and then the middle ear space. So the tympanic membrane has three layers. The outermost layer is continuous with the skin and the ear canal. The middle layer is where all the stretchy elastic fibers are, and then the inner layer of the ear canal is continuous with the mucous membrane that lines the middle ear space. The tympanic membrane, or TM, is at the end of the external auditory meatus. These are two pictures of fairly normal looking eardrums. This is what you might see when you look in somebody's ear. Additionally, the middle ear is filled with space, and then it has the ossicles and then the oval and round window, which both open into the cochlea. So the ossicles, are the malleus, incus, and stapes, where the manubrium of the malleus is physically connected to the eardrum, and then there's a joint between the malleus and the incus, and a joint between the incus and the stapes right here, and then the footplate of the stapes sits in the oval window and acts like a piston moving in and out of the oval window, causing a fluid wave in the cochlea. Also not to be forgotten is the eustachian tube, which connects the middle ear space here to the back of the nose and throat. And in this picture you can see clearly it is surrounded by cartilage, and the cartilage is what causes the eustachian tube to open and close. And when we start talking about conductive hearing loss, we're going to talk about otitis media and eustachian tube dysfunction. And then we also have the two muscles in the middle ear space. So you have the tensor tympani muscle here, and then the stapedius muscle here. And we're going to talk at length, here's the stapedius muscle again. We're going to talk at length about the stapedius muscle when we start to talk about acoustic reflexes. And this close-up here actually gives you another nice shot of seeing the foot plate of the stapes sitting right inside the oval window. So the inner ear includes the cochlea and the vestibule and all of the semicircular canals and vestibular organs as well. This is one view of it. This is looking directly from the side. This is showing you only the soft structures that make up the inner ear, and you can see the vestibular and auditory nerves and all the tiny little nerve fibers here that run from the inner ear to the brainstem. So the inner ear has the auditory system, and also a large part of the vestibular system is present in the inner ear as well. So you have the cochlea over here, here's the oval window, the vestibule, which houses some of the vestibular organs, and then the three semicircular canals. The inner ear is essentially a hard, bony shell and bony labyrinth that is filled with soft tissue on the inside. And so it's a completely closed fluid system where you can see it's essentially a fluid-tight water system, with the exception of the cochlear aqueduct here, which drains into cerebrospinal fluid. In this diagram, all of what you see in blue are the structures, the soft tissue structures that are filled with endolymph. And the white surrounding it would be the structures that are filled with perilymph. And so if you look at the cochlea specifically, and not the vestibular structures, you know the central channel in the cochlea, the scala media, is filled with endolymph, while the scala vestibuli and the scala tympani are filled with perilymph. And never should perilymph and endolymph meet each other. So again, here's a close-up. Here's the snail shell of the bony cochlea. And you can see to the right over here, we have the scala vestibuli on top, the scala media, which is the middle, and then the scala tympani down here at the bottom. And the top and bottom are filled with perilymph. The central channel here is filled with endolymph. And then you can see the auditory nerve fibers coming out from the length of the scala media to all collect together and form one wire, such as it is down here, which is the 8th cranial nerve. This I just think is a cool picture of the scala vestibuli, scala tympani. The scala media is here. You've got the tectorial membrane and the organ of Corti down here. And you can see these little things that look like hairs are actually the nerve fibers. So you can actually get a really clear sense of how they go in, they connect to the hair cells, and then they just sort of fan out like threads between the bony portions of the cochlea. We're going to look in just a minute up close here at the organ of Corti. But just another reminder, perilymph is neutral, it doesn't have a charge. Endolymph has a very high positive charge, and that's because of its high potassium concentration. The organ of Corti is really, really, really important. It's where all the hair cells that do the heavy lifting with hearing all exist. This is a close-up of the hair cells. You have these 3 rows of outer hair cells that are sort of long and cylindrical, and up here you can see this is 1 row of inner hair cells, and the inner hair cells look a bit more like blobs. Additionally, you should remember that the cochlea has tonotopic organization, which means that different sounds of different frequencies are perceived at different locations along the basilar membrane, which is what the organ of Corti sits on. So very high frequency sounds are perceived at the base end of the cochlea, the end that is where the stapes footplate is, and the very low frequency sounds are perceived at the apex of the cochlea, the top sort of point on the snail shell. This website is a fantastic demonstration of how the auditory system works that I will show you in just a minute. Okay, so this is the Hanover website that's going to show us a great animation of what the different structures in the ear are actually doing as sound is going through. So, when we go to play the sound up here, you can see the air molecules are moving in the external auditory meatus. They're setting the tympanic membrane right here into motion. That's causing the malleus, incus, and stapes to move in turn and causing a fluid wave in the cochlea, moving the basilar membrane and then moving the hair cells sitting on top of the basilar membrane. So if we look over here, if we increase the amplitude of the sound, what we should see is that the movement gets larger. The wave gets larger, the ossicles are moving more, but the peak of the wave is going to be at roughly the same place. And you can see every time the stapes footplate pushes in, the round window bows out to give the fluid a little bit of room to displace and wave. And then likewise, if we go up here and we move the frequency slider, higher frequency sounds are going to have their maximal displacement closer to the base of the cochlea. And also, remember, frequency is the same as cycles per second. So as we increase the frequency, the movement, the peak of the wave is going to get closer to the base, but the movement is going to get faster. So at 10,000 hertz, the stapes footplate is actually physically moving in and out of the oval window 10,000 times per second. And you can see as the sound gets more intense that we actually do get a fairly large range of motion with the basilar membrane. So this is a great, I put the web address itself is in the slides, and I really encourage you, especially if you really need a refresher on some of this anatomy and physiology, to come to this website and play around a little bit to make sure that your understanding here is solid. So once we get past the cochlea, then we are looking at the eighth cranial nerve, or the auditory nerve, where you have the fibers that come into the cochlea, they connect to the hair cells, then they exit the cochlea and go from the cochlea to the brainstem, and then at that point you start up the brainstem pathway to the auditory cortex. This is the brainstem pathway to the auditory cortex. If you don't already know the CSLIM acronym, I suggest you get familiar with it. It's a nice, easy way to remember all of the central auditory structures. You've got the C from cochlear nucleus, and here are the two cochlear nucleus stops. You've got the S from superior olivary complex, the L from lateral lemniscus, the I from inferior colliculus, the M from medial geniculate body, and then the last stop is the auditory cortex part in the brain. A couple of things I just wanted to remind you about related to the central auditory system is, first, if you follow input from the left ear only, you'll see it goes directly to the cochlear nuclei on both sides, but then starting at the level of the SOC is actually getting, on both sides, is getting input from the left ear. So starting at the superior olivary complex, that's where what's called bilateral representation or binaural representation takes place. So the SOC is where you first start to get information from both ears being analyzed together. And so ultimately, even if you only looked at the left ear, the information that's being heard in the left ear ends up going to both the left and right auditory cortex. The other thing that it's important to know, the central auditory nervous system is responsible for complex processing of auditory stimuli, both speech stimuli and non-speech stimuli. Things like localization, figuring out where sound is coming from, categorizing sounds into environmental sounds, music, speech, etc. Deciding when a sound requires more attention or requires a person to alert. These are all complex auditory skills that happen in the central auditory nervous system. Looking at novelty of a sound and recognition and whether or not you've heard a sound before. Classifying and understanding different parts of speech, and ultimately understanding language is also part of the central auditory nervous system.